Do you know who has access to what? This is the Identity at the Center podcast. If you're looking for identity and access management talk, you've come to the right place. And now, on to the show.
Welcome to another episode of the Identity at the Center podcast. We are back to a normal show, in quotation marks that you cannot see. Took our talents to Clearwater Beach a couple weeks ago for our annual company meeting and recorded a live episode, which was a lot of fun down there with the Identity team. We played an IAM themed version of Family Feud, Jim. That was good times.
It was good times. You know, the funny thing was we're down there taking our talents to Clearwater Beach. We spent a fair amount of time outside. I came back to Georgia this weekend and got sunburned. I don't get it.
Well, I went from Florida to Mexico and then back to Chicago area. So I went from like 80 degrees to 30 degrees in snow within a span of a day, which that's the wrong direction.
Jeff, can you imagine how many people are listening to our podcast right now and feeling sorry for us? Clearwater Beach, Mexico. Come on.
Right, exactly. These are all clearly first world problems, and I'm not complaining, just making an observation. That's all.
Yeah, that's true.
But the Family Feud episode was definitely a good one. I had a good time hosting it, and you're running kind of the board. And it's episode number 19 at identityatthecenter.com or wherever you get your podcasts, whether that's Spotify or Apple or something else. But definitely want to encourage folks to check it out and let us know what they thought about it. Curious to see what people think about that kind of change of pace from what we normally do, kind of week in, week out. And always encourage that feedback at questions@identityatthecenter.com. So I'm curious to see what people think, and hopefully they enjoyed that episode, because it definitely was something different and a lot more kind of fun than what we normally would do.
Well, Jeff, don't forget, we are social. We're also on Twitter. We're also on Instagram. We are just social butterflies of the world.
Yeah, I'm terrible on the social media. I typically would do the Instagram stuff if I can remember to do it, every other week or so. But yeah, that's not our strong, at least not my strong game. Maybe that's something we have to figure out.
Well, I found that for this industry, for people who are maybe new to the industry, if you're trying to figure out which social platform you're going to get the most value out of, I think it's Twitter. There are several folks out there who really are very active on Twitter, and obviously they mix in some personal and some political and all that stuff. But you can find a lot of good links to, news events that are taking place, roadmaps, things like that. And I use it personally for that reason. It's just, find out what's going on, find out what is breaking, if there are any white papers released, things like that. And that's how I kind of feed my brain.
Yeah, Twitter's, I think, is up there. Is LinkedIn considered social at this point? I don't know if it really is or not.
I'm not sure how to answer that question. It seems like a platform for folks to, hit you up with new job offers or job opportunities, which
that don't line up at whatsoever with whatever you're already working on, right?
Wouldn't you like to get into construction project management, Jeff?
Yeah, I think that would be a great fit for someone who's never done it, but has the keywords of project and management and construction somewhere in my my profile.
Constructed an e-commerce website.
Right. Well, clearly you're new to building things,
Yes. Kind of a crane operator.
All right. Well, I don't think we're here to talk about jobs in the space, at least not today. I think what we want to focus on today was really around different product trends that we're seeing in the identity governance and administration space. We know that Gartner just released their Magic Quadrant for IGA a few weeks ago, and we did an episode on that. And I think we want to take the opportunity to kind of take a look and really talk about what we're seeing as trends coming up in the future, not necessarily where we've been, but where are things going. And just kind of throw the conversation back and forth between the two of us. Why don't we start with AI, Jim? Is that just a fad, or is that something that's going to keep growing?
I think, just let's talk about what does AI mean in the context of identity governance and administration. I really think it's about looking at a user and kind of predicting the access they might need. So if I was a user doing kind of self-service, for example, and I went into the IGA platform and it knew who I was, it might say, hey, you might need this access. It's almost kind of like that shopping cart idea that Amazon uses, or a lot of e-commerce sites use, where you pop one thing into a shopping cart and they say, users like you have also purchased these items. Just the idea that, and I kind of feel like there's a place for AI, but I'm not sure that that's it, right? I don't feel like I want my identity system recommending, hey, you may want to up purchase some additional access. Because to me, I start with the basis of least privilege. And
Mhm.
I don't really want people to have access that they shouldn't have, or that not even that they shouldn't have, but that they don't need. They don't need the access to do their job. I don't want to try to convince them or market to them that they should have the access.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if you're of the least privileged fan club, which I think we both are,
Hmm.
having AI recommend additional access runs counter to that. Maybe it is accurate, maybe it isn't. I don't really see that as a primary use case. I think of AI more as on the analytics side, being able to spot trends, right? People logging in at weird times, accessing resources maybe they don't normally, and using it more of a detective control to try and spot some sort of identity incident or incidents that might be taking place. They're good at, the robots are good at sorting out kind of patterns and things like that, and being able to kind of bring that stuff up to the top that would normally get lost. So when I think of AI, I'm right on with you around the access request. I don't know if that necessarily makes sense. I'm not sold on it, but I could certainly see the value on it from an analytics perspective, and trying to detect things and then do something with that.
Yeah, and maybe it's a convergence of the space, because I think what you talked about there, I agree. There's tremendous value with big data, seeing trends, or pulling in big data in terms of actual usage patterns, detecting the patterns, figuring out the trends, and then spotting anomalies and being able to take action on those. I don't think of those within the strict space of identity governance. I definitely think they're within the realm of what the identity and access management team should be responsible for. And of course, that depends organization to organization. But I think there's a space today called user behavior analytics, and to me, that's kind of where that form of um, artificial intelligence really belongs, or exists.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think the one part where I think AI can be helpful on the access request side is maybe around bots, and not necessarily in suggesting access that would be appropriate, but helping people find what they're already looking for from a request perspective. I know
Yeah,
Microsoft
totally.
has done some work in this space, with chatbots and stuff like that. And I think I don't remember if it's Savient or SailPoint. One of them has started to look at bots as well. And this was an idea I had internally here on our side a couple of years ago. Was how maybe we might be able to leverage bots to kind of modernize the access request process. I thought it would be kind of a cool idea to have some sort of like IAM bot where you could say, hey, I'm looking for this type of access. How can I find it? And kind of maybe replace the traditional kind of web-based approach, or maybe supplement it. So I think AI could probably be helpful there, but it's more on the understanding component, right? What is the person typing and what is their intent? And try to match it up with something somewhere in a catalog or a database to say, hey, okay, I think this is what you're looking for. Is that right? And then helping with the process of requesting access.
And that's right on. It's when my kids want to find something today, they say, "Hey Siri, you know, what is
Right.
this?" And then they expect Siri to figure it out, which rarely is she able to figure it out. If she could even make sense of what they're saying, the answer is usually, this website might help you.
Right.
But yeah, I could imagine exactly a scenario like you're talking about, where it's you go into the chat bot and say, I need to give Jane access like John has. And then the system might come back with a question saying, what what does John have access to that Jane? Oh, it's this mainframe application that I could say, John has, assuming you have the right level of security, John has this role to that mainframe application. Perfect.
Mhm.
That's what I needed. Now I can go through and request that role for Jane, and then it would go through the standard approval process. So, like you said, trying to understand, I think that would be a fantastic use of AI.
All right, I'm going to take that example and even take it a stretch further. What if that was the request process, right? So you're talking to the chat bot or whatever it is. You find out what access you're looking for, and then all of a sudden the chat bot reaches out to you as the approver of that access. Say, hey, Jeff is requesting this access. Is that okay? And you just type yes or no.
Right.
I think that would be pretty cool and a pretty modern way to do it. I think it would take some work to get it set up, but I think it's something that would be an interesting use case, going forward.
So this is this is kind of off subject a little bit, but since it's kind of come up, I just wanted to throw something out there. So we've had a lot of customers over time where we go in and they say, the way access typically gets requested here is model after, or that's what we call it. We're kind of
Mhm.
IAM nerds, but it's, you know, John is going to do the job that Jane was doing, set John up like Jane. And you go into, what they're doing current state is they go in and somebody gives John everything that Jane has. The problem is that Jane may have been there 20 years and moved to different roles and accumulated a lot more access than John really should have. And so, one of the ways that I've seen clients take care of this problem is that the problem really still exists. If you take away that feature or that ability to model after, then you're just leaving the business user in a lurch and they don't know what to request. But if you make it available to them so that they can see what Jane had access to, and then they can go and individually request those items for John, that's a way to kind of address that model after requirement. It's not actually just make it a copy and paste, but make it so that they can at least have visibility to what the person was that they wanted to model after.
Yeah, I chalk up that make me like someone else as one of two things. Either it's too hard to make the request as it should be, or I don't know what I'm supposed to be asking for. And I think having that information up front, makes a lot of sense, especially since most modern IGA solutions will, be able to tell you who has access to what. And that snowball of access that I like to call it, when someone's moved around an organization or has been there for a while, right? And they've accumulated all this access. And most companies are really good about giving access and not so great at taking it away. That's definitely a threat that comes up when you use the model after type approach. But I think if you could do maybe some sort of hybrid where it's, I know I want to make, Jane look like John, but let me pick the things that Jane has, then that would probably be a more accurate way to do it. Maybe a little bit easier. If you're not using roles, for example. So I think a lot
Right.
of
Yeah.
companies want to go to roles, but it's a lot harder than it really is.
Yeah. I think you brought up a hidden point there, which about the two reasons why people do the model after. And the first one was it's too much work. Sometimes you have to find the right balance, right? You don't want to have it so that it's like, oh my gosh, managing access is such a nightmare. It's so many steps, it's jumping through hoops. But at the same time, everything can't be an easy button. Because if what you said was, all right, we're going to say to solve the model after problem, we're going to do what Jim said, which is we're going to show Jane's access, and then she can just check box for each one that she wants to give to John, and then just hit submit. Now it's so easy that rather than think through it, I'm just going to check everything and submit.
Right.
I'm not even going to put any thought into it. And I worked with a client not too long ago where they showed me their access review process, and it was a little painful. There really were a lot of things that the manager had to look at. At the end of the day, my thought was, well, there's security implications. Like, it's the manager's job to know what their employee has access to and to approve it. And so, yes, we have to take an approach to tweak and make it a little bit easier. But the idea isn't just that it's an easy button. They can go in 5 minutes and review everybody's access once a year. I mean, think about if you're a manager of people at a company and you review, you do employee reviews, like how were you as an employee? Did you meet your goals that you set at the beginning of the year? That's a process. You have to put hours of work into that if you're a manager. And if you have 20 employees, you have to put hours of work into each one of those 20 employees. And I think, information security doesn't have to be quite that painful, but I think there should be an expectation that there's some level of effort that needs to go into it because it is important.
Yeah, it should be a conscious choice, I think. I think, we have to consider what is the alternative. Why do people have to do that is because people move around the organization and maybe they don't have roles and they do flex between different positions, right? Another thing that comes up is, well, this person's taking a new role, but we need them to work in their old role for, 2 weeks, 2 months, whatever it may be. And then it becomes, okay, well, now you had this person kind of straddling two different roles. If everything was binary and data quality was perfect coming from HR system and, everything coming in, you had an IGA system that could automate based off of that, I think we'd see far fewer problems. But we all live in the real world where things get messy and there are decisions that have to be made around that as far as, what role should someone be in and extensions of access because they're moving from one team to another. Incorrect data coming from, HR, maybe HR data isn't as timely as it should be. There's just a lot of things that can kind of go wrong. So it comes down to typically the manager making the decision. And I feel like anything we can do to help that person make a good decision is beneficial for everybody involved. Helps security, helps the request process move along quicker, and makes, spreads accountability throughout the organization and not just, some arbitrary IM team or security or someone else making a decision of what's appropriate or not.
Yeah.
What about role mining?
We both like artificial intelligence, and
yes,
if it's used in the right way.
If it's used in the right way, right? Yeah, exactly. Is there a role for AI with things like role mining?
So I'm going to start out with just a statement, which is that I've never liked role mining. I never could get on board with its value.
That's a hot take, Jim.
That's a hot take. I'm just going to throw it out there because I've never thought it was good.
You're gonna make a lot of IGA vendors very unhappy because they always hang their head on that. And I agree with you, by the way. I think it's a very high hanging fruit. It is something that most companies never even get to, or should they even consider?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like roles have to make sense to people. And I feel like role mining goes out there and tries to figure out these access patterns and say, because we're seeing a pattern here, you should turn this into a role. Now, if it so happened that came back and it made sense to bundle that into a role, that's fine. But I think what roles are better used as is something that makes sense to business people. Okay, he's an employee, or he's or she is a contractor. He works in accounting, or she works in Detroit, in the Detroit office. So, give me some examples, but those make sense to people. Now, what makes up what those roles can do? Now, could role mining help with that? I think any source of information could potentially be helpful, but I think taking a top-down approach to look at what do people in Detroit actually need? What is the common theme for people in Detroit? Well, maybe they just need access to a certain SharePoint for the Detroit office emergency calendar. Maybe it's that, and they need access to the parking system in that Detroit office. I don't know. If you're in IT, maybe you need certain systems, but it's got to make sense to human beings, because human beings are the ones who have to make the decision on whether or not to allocate that role to somebody, to provision that role to somebody. Yes, true with that. Well, and if it ever gets away from that, then where does the accountability come down to in terms of someone had access that they shouldn't. They used it inappropriately. What are we going to do? Fire the machine?
Siri, another mistake.
Oh, you're doing the best you can, Siri. It's okay.
Right.
But I also, the other thing with role mining that I don't like is, okay, so what I've seen a lot of IGA vendors do is that they see a compilation so say you define a role and you say a role includes these three entitlements. Now, if someone out there gets those three entitlements, maybe through different mechanisms, either through other roles or individual entitlements, the IGA system is now going to say that person's in the role too. I don't like that. I don't think somebody should be put into a role because they just happen to qualify for the role because they had the entitlements that build up the role. And I've actually seen a client, I thought this was one of the coolest things, was that when they built their roles, they would put an artificial entitlement in it so that somebody didn't end up in the role by way of accidentally accumulating the entitlements that make up that role. So when they went and did an access review to a manager who had to approve the role, they didn't see, oh, this person has the accounting role, and you shouldn't have the accounting role. You're not an accountant. I'm going to take you out of that role. So I don't like that approach. And then the third thing that I don't like is I don't like a system that would say, and I know that there are the ability to kind of change the variables, but I wouldn't like a system to say, 95% of the people in this department have this role. So why not give it to 100%? Well, because least privilege.
Right. Yeah.
If those
our first point.
our first point, the thing we were talking about with AI, if those 5% of people don't need that access, why in the world would you give it to them? Because they work in that department? To me, that's crazy.
Yeah. I think I think I follow along with you pretty much the entire way. I think the only part where I would maybe diverge a little bit might be more of a macro role. And maybe it's not even a role. I consider it more like an attribute-based access control where, maybe it's the concept of all employees should have access to the SharePoint site because it's for benefits. As long as it's very specific and is not trying to do too much, I think there's a benefit there for some sort of, automation to kind of self-correct. Maybe, the system was down and didn't do it from an automation perspective, or maybe, human error got involved, et cetera. I could see something like that being helpful. Or maybe even collecting accounts that were created out of band and assigning some sort of, group to them so that they filter out into some sort of report that people can review and say, hey, where did this account come from? Why didn't it go through the proper process? But I think those are very, very specific use cases and not really what IGA vendors are going for when they talk about, oh, we have, a role mining capability. I'm thinking of more of a very specific, very narrow targeted use case that, like in those scenarios I described, helps self-correct where needed.
And I think more information is better. There's the classic example of, they have DNA testing now. And so the question becomes, if you have a predisposal to a certain type of cancer, do you want to know it? And me personally, I do want to know, because I might be able to make lifestyle changes. Some people look at it as like, well, then I'm going to live my life thinking I'm going to die when I'm 30. And if that doesn't happen, but for me, I'd rather have the information. So I think more information is good. So if 98% of the people have this role, or 98% of the people in this role have this other entitlement, maybe the 2% didn't get it because 2% of people didn't get it because of whatever reason, something like you said, or maybe they were in the system before that role was built, or I don't know. I'm not coming up with a good example there, but I'm not opposed to more information, I guess.
Yeah.
I just don't think it's tremendously valuable. I think if people can't get access to things that they need access to, they're going to say, I need access to this.
I think the data is important. I think the suggestion of adding it just based on some sort of arbitrary AI maybe is a step too far, at least for me right now.
Right.
What's another trend that we've seen? What about APIs? I think this is a very important one, especially if things are moving around into the cloud and other areas where you're not doing maybe an on-premise access automation or even a governance cycle. Being able to pull things back from an API perspective and wrap it into whatever interface you want is a good trend. What do you think?
Well, I think APIs is definitely the way everything's going. I think that, well, let's say number one, I don't think all the IGA systems have the greatest user interface. I don't think most companies are, I don't think 99% of the companies are going to write a new user interface just because they want one to look better for their internal population. But if an IGA system is, for example, being used for an external use case, wrapping it in your own user interface is definitely something you could do. Another thing is, I mean, a lot of the ITSM systems where, I think this is the biggest trend is ITSM systems being the front end toward an IGA back end. From an IT manager, they just want one place for people to go. I've seen some ITSM front ends that blow away anything I've seen in the IGA space. And usually it's because IGA just has, so many different options to choose from and things like that, that it's very easy for a UI to get complex pretty quickly. But I just feel like, why wouldn't you want to enable that from an API perspective? And I think the best applications are built with the core functionality being in the API, and then they write the UI on top of that to interface with the same APIs that you can make available to your applications. I don't think most organizations will end up using them that extensively, but I think it's the right way to go.
Yeah, I can see some very specific use cases that it's very handy in, right? Checking like a training database or things like that, where you need to make a decision on access based on some sort of other data point that is not in your IGA platform, or feeding data into the IGA platform. I think what you brought up around ITSM is a huge one. That has been a struggle for many organizations. Where do you put your access requests? The IAM team typically is biased towards the IAM system, and the IT support team is typically biased towards whatever the ticketing system is. And you're right. I think we've seen a growth in the capabilities of ITSM tools to have a much better interface. And that is really becoming the front door, and being able to pass off an approved request to the IGA platform to just handle the provisioning side of it, I think is a good step towards making things easier for folks. Now, I don't think ITSM interfaces are that great yet, right? I mean, most people trying to figure out a ticket, ServiceNow or, Remedy, I've seen some real nightmare scenarios of, trying to figure out what am I supposed to type in here? And, is it free text? And people putting in sensitive information, the comments, things like that. But I think having the flexibility to be able to take advantage of it when it makes sense is a very good development. And I hope that, more IGA vendors will enable that for more of their services across provisioning, password management, all the different parts of their products.
Yeah, and the most important is the account correlation and having a whatever you want to call it, an entitlements database, one place to go to know who has access to what. I don't see ITSM, moving toward that.
Yeah. What about things around governance? Being able to approve whether or not access is appropriate or not, and having some sort of access review cycles. What are you seeing around that?
Well, I think, event-driven reviews is a big thing now. Being able to, define rules so that if, let's say, an account gets locked out and then unlocked, or there's passwords reset twice within 24 hours, I'm coming up with some scenarios where you say, hey, that's some fishy activity. Maybe we should have somebody review the access to make sure it's still appropriate. If you can integrate something like your SOC or your user behavior analytics to catch that fishy activity and report back to the IGA system, that, you know, let's just say, I think one of the biggest improvements that is happening or has happened in the IGA space is the use of risk, having risk scoring, kind of like a credit score, and you can compare, all right, I have this credit score and I want to apply for a loan that requires a certain credit score, and you have to be at a certain number to pass. And I think it's kind of conceptually very similar, where you can say if you can raise a user's credit score or their risk score high enough, then certain activities would be triggered, like a governance review, an access review. Another would be risk scoring around different types of access. So you could say that access to the SharePoint, to the SharePoint homepage is like a very low risk event, but access to SAP is a very high risk event. And you might even get to the point where if somebody goes in and requests SharePoint, it doesn't even go through an approval, because you say, all that we're keeping on SharePoint is, some very low risk information that we've classified that data as, public data or share data that you can share outside the organization. Then why even require a manager to approve that? However, with SAP that just the hurdle of getting into SAP, they could have access to numbers or product lists and things, like information that is secret or private, that you require that they go through approvals. Maybe it's a two-step approval even. But using risk, I think, is a big development within the IGA space, a very important development. It allows you to kind of accomplish what we were talking about earlier, where you don't inundate managers with too much to approve, and at the same time, you don't compromise and say, we're going to make it so easy, just hit the easy button. And then the event-driven access reviews, I think, is a nice improvement in the access review space. We're not just going to review monthly or quarterly or annually, but we're also going to review when something fishy appears to be taking place.
Yeah, the dynamic review, or on-demand review, whatever we want to kind of call it. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially like in a scenario like a transfer, right? Someone moving from one group to another. If the facts change from an attribute perspective and the access doesn't line up with what they should be, kicking off some sort of on-demand micro certification that says, hey, Jeff is, moved to this new group. Is this access still appropriate or not? I think that's a lost opportunity that a lot of organizations really aren't doing, and they struggle with it. And I think things like that, where that use of risk makes a lot of sense. It was funny. It was one of the questions that came up during our Family Feud game was, how often should an organization recertify access? And we had numbers all over the place. I think we had, I don't remember if it was 4 or 5 different answers, but the common ones: monthly, quarterly, yearly. The one that people didn't get was dynamic, and that was a common answer that we saw from the dashboard team. And it kind of was like, oh yeah, that makes sense when you think about it.
Well, the funny thing is with the Family Feud game it was a survey that was sent around to the company. So like, right, these are people's own answers that were being given back to them. So
right, yeah, I had to remind them a few times that I was like, hey, if you don't like these answers, you guys are the ones that filled this out.
I know, that was the funny part of the whole thing.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's probably a pretty good spot to leave it, unless you've got anything else you want to add.
I do have. So I wrote down a few notes. Yeah. So one of the things, that you and I have complained to each other about for years is non-employee source of record.
Yes.
System. I mean, this is something that, okay, most companies don't want to put their contingent workforce, in other words, their non-employees, in their HR system. two reasons. One is they use their HR system for payroll. That's like the primary purpose. And second is HR is really does not consider themselves responsible for those people. And so they don't want them in their system. And so, as IAM practitioners, we still have to find an authoritative source for these folks. Mm-hmm. And so what you've seen pop up now are some systems that, proprietary systems for managing that type of user. And then if you want to just manage those people in the IGA system, which is what most customers expect, it's like we have to kind of do backflips. But I think we're seeing more of a trend toward finally, IGA vendors are getting it that, that's what customers want.
Yeah, I have no idea why this has taken so long, but I'm going to tell you right now, IGA vendors, if you're listening, this should have been a day one feature to expect, an identity source for all of your users and not be able to do that with your own product. I think that's a huge miss and a lost opportunity for at least a decade, if not longer, when products they just assume, oh, well, they're going to be in the HR system. No, they're not in the real world. So IGA vendors, if you're listening and if you're building an IGA platform, make sure you have a way to account for identities. If they're not coming from an authoritative source, you've got to be able to master those identities and have a process, to get them into your system, with the right approvals and the right attributes and all that stuff. That's driven me crazy for a long time, and I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, amen. So my next one is going to be another one that I think we can recommend to the IGA vendors, which is better integration with SSO systems. So one thing that I think Microsoft does really well, and probably could because it's a closed ecosystem, is if you go out to, say, OneDrive and you try to go to a folder that you have not been given access to yet, it'll give you a little message. You don't have access. Click here to request it. Mm-hmm. If you click there, it's been a while since they've done the workflow, but it essentially sends an email to the person who manages that OneDrive and says, Jim McDonald wants access to your folder. Do you want to give him access? Why can't we have that for everything? So if let's say I'm using a single sign-on system and an IGA system, but I'm a Joe average user and I go out to my Concur expense management system and it says, you don't have access, click here to get access, that it would send so say my SSO system thinks I don't have access. I don't have the entitlement to use that app. It throws up a message saying you don't have access. Right now it would just say you don't have access, and I'd be kind of stuck there. Why not be able to just deep link it so that they click on that link, it sends me back to my IGA system with right at the page, maybe everything's filled out already that says, for the self-service access request, I can request access to that Concur page. To me, that just seems like such an improvement from a usability perspective. And I don't think it would be that hard to do, especially, you could do it all with APIs and just, defining a format for the message that you expect to be sent, or the message. Essentially, here's the redirect URL that you need to send me. That's going to have all the parameters in it that I need. And then you would just need your SSO system to throw up that page with that link that would send all those parameters.
I think that's a killer. That's a killer use case. I think part of the reason we don't see it today is that I'm trying to think right now on the spot if there's any IGA vendors that have a big enough SSO part of their product as well, where they can control that ecosystem like Microsoft does on their side.
Right. You're exactly right. It's if there was an IGA vendor who was also a cloud IDP, cloud SSO vendor, they probably would have that wired into their own. But I guess what I'm saying is try to set it up as like an open API. Don't worry about whether or not you're getting paid by the SSO vendor or not. Make the API available. And then the last thing, for the IGA vendors, the thing I keep seeing is that in the customer IAM space, when it comes to user lifecycle management, the ability to manage users, self-service and administratively, there's a gap around that in terms of a product focus. So there's a lot of authentication capabilities and very basic user lifecycle management. You usually have registration and some light administration screens, but you don't see a whole lot in terms of the ability to do delegated administration to customers, things like that. That's what the conversation we were having earlier about kind of having an API focus, but a lot of clients come to us and say, all right, we want to look for a system that does, we can use to replace our web authentication, but we also need to replace our web user management system. There's usually so many gaps between what's available commercially and what they have currently that they either need to, really change functionality or reduce functionality, reduce customizations, or rebuild. So, or keep what they have. So I just feel like that's an area where IGA could really extend its footprint.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you really hit it, right on the head. So I don't have anything to add to that one. That was like perfectly summed up. Well done. All right. Anything else?
No, another excellent, hopefully excellent episode. I don't want to pat myself on the back too much.
No, I think it was another good one. I think coming up in the pipeline, we're going to have some conversation around blockchain. So that's something to stay tuned for. Hopefully we'll get that one recorded later this week and put it out as part of next week in the next episode. But that's something to look forward to as well. So I think we'll call it for today. Again, appreciate everyone listening. Feel free to share it with your friends, your enemies, and everyone in between. The show continues to grow, and we appreciate that. Where can they find us from an email perspective? That would be at questions@identityatthecenter.com. If you guys want to listen to the Family Feud episode, that was episode 19, and let us know what you thought about it, that would be great. If you've got ideas for other types of shows and topics, that's definitely the place to send those messages to as well. And with that, I think we'll call it. Thanks, everybody.
You've been listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. To access all episodes, visit identityatthecenter.com.
All right, I'm recording now. I'll start the clock.
It's a half-hour podcast. We had the timer. We didn't record a word of it.
It was our best show ever. Maybe I'll make the blooper reel.